Hello, I'm Bill O'Donnell, and welcome to another program on spirituality. Today in the studio we have a dignitary, so to speak, formerly of Albuquerque, New Mexico, now working, among other places, Dominican University back in Illinois in the Chicago area. And he is in New Mexico teaching at the Santa Fe Institute for Spirituality. As he did 20 years ago in 1986, he was the first speaker at the Institute for Spirituality, and because few of us were there at the time, I invited him to come in, and so that you can all get to meet Dominican Father Richard Woods from Albuquerque. Welcome, Father.
Thank you.
It's good to have you. Tell the folks a little bit at home, and you're a local New Mexico boy, right?
I am. I was born here. My mother was born here in Albuquerque, no less.
Wow. Yeah.
And I was born, back in the ancient era, and I grew up in New Mexico, largely in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Used to come up to Santa Fe on occasions in the Jemez Mountains. My great-grandmother had a boarding house in the Jemez Mountains that Father Gerald Fitzgerald eventually swapped her for a farm. And that became the mother house of the Handmaids of the Precious Blood.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That was your family?
That was our family house.
I've been there. I've done retreats there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Father Liam Hoare and Father Ray Gunzel. Well, Father Ray taught with you that year later,
right.
And he came back again, and Father Liam came back and gave us a week one time. Wonderful.
Right. Wonderful people. And we knew Father Gerald Fitzgerald very well. Our family was very much connected with the servants of the Paraclete. So I used to go up and work with my father and uncle in doing plumbing work for Gerald when they got the new novitiate and so on. We'd go in there and we'd take care of it for him. And one day we were down, my father and I were working covered with grease, and we were down in the basement. I think it was the novitiate building, and Bishop Burton came down, Archbishop Burton. He wanted to see what was going on. And you know, he was one of the last of the princes, you know, the old kind of hierarchs that we had here. And but he was a kind
What year
of
was this?
sweet and gentle man. It had to be
In the 50s?
oh sure, no, it was in the 50s. It was probably 1955, 56, somewhere there. And Edwin Vincent Byrne came down, shook hands with us, wanted to see what we were doing down there, you know. And I have to admit, I was touched by that. It was a great experience. But, and Gerald Fitzgerald, who I think was one of the holiest men I ever met, and also Brother Matthias, by the way, who we knew very well.
The Shepherds.
The Little Brothers of the Good Shepherd. And yeah, we knew him. He was a good Irishman. And Gerald was the last person I saw in New Mexico before going to the Dominican novitiate in 1962. And he blessed me as I went off. You know, he died shortly after that, but he was wonderful, wonderful man. So yeah, my roots go back really to the 1880s when my grandmother came here from Ireland, directly from Ireland, with their whole family, 13 kids, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother.
What were their names?
Powers. And then my grandmother married a Corcoran, and they had come from Nebraska, and through Leadville and Silverton, Colorado, at the turn of the century. So my great-grandmother, who had the old boarding house in Jemez, came down from Silverton, Colorado in a covered wagon, if you can imagine, the turn of the century. So yeah, we are old New Mexico in that sense. Not as old as some of my friends.
Right, but significant nonetheless.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So tell us about your call, the priesthood. Where did you get that? Who stimulated that?
Well, it was a variety of things. I went to the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. I got a scholarship after graduating from St. Mary's in Albuquerque. And I met the Dominicans there. They were impressive. I had met a few of the guys in Albuquerque. I knew them. My brother was 2 years ahead of me.
They were at the Newman Center at that time?
The Newman Center, University of New Mexico, yeah. And I came back from Catholic U, and I had stopped in Chicago to meet the vocation director with a friend of mine from Santa Fe who was interested in becoming a Dominican, who eventually did not. But the vocation director showed up sometime later and just wanted to see me and talk. And it was the summer I was working in a filling station in Albuquerque. And it kind of worked on me. They had asked me at one time or another if I'd ever been interested in the Dominicans, and I said, well, not really. You know, I mean, nice guys, but, you know, I've got other plans. And within 6 months, I was lined up for the novitiate. Mm-hmm. You know, it was just one of those things. And one of the, I would say, New Mexico has a lot to do with it in one sense. That one night, I can remember well, we were up, oh gosh, it was near Cuesta, New Mexico, up we're fishing. And I was standing out on the hillside one night, just kind of pondering what the devil I wanted to do with my life. And a shooting star flashed by. I'd never seen anything so beautiful or powerful in my life, really. It was a huge meteorite, and it shot across the sky. It was like a knife that somebody, and if you know the skies in northern Mexico in those days, I mean, the sky was black and the stars were absolutely magnificent. And it was like someone had taken a knife and slashed across the sky, and this brilliant blue-white light, you know, just filled the whole thing. And at that moment, I kind of knew, you know, what I was going to do, and that's what I did.
That's impressive.
So here I am.
So it sounds a little bit like the stars that the wise men followed all the way to
well, actually,
to Bethlehem.
I never thought of it for years and years later, but there is a true story about St. Dominic, who founded the order. And I guess it came home to me. I was at Fangeau, it was a little town on a hilltop in southern France, where Dominic was the parish priest at the time. He'd been left behind. His bishop had gone back to Spain and died during the middle of a preaching mission that they had. And Dominic didn't know what to do. He knew something had to happen, that he was making no progress preaching against the heretics of the time. They were later called Albigensians. And he was standing on the edge of this old hill town, and he saw a star fall. And it changed his life. And that place is still there. There's a statue of St. Dominic. He's commemorated there. And he founded the first house of the Dominican order, even though there was no Dominican order at the time, at Pruy. And it was a house for women who had been converted back from the heresy. Mm-hmm. And it's still there. It's the oldest house of Dominican sisters in the world. Mm-hmm. They're nuns. And they weren't nuns of the order then. They had really the Cistercian rule. And later they, of course, became Dominican nuns.
So for any of you folks out there, guys, thinking about your vocation, go out at night and look up in the sky. God may have a word for you that way.
Especially here in New Mexico, where you can still see stars. You know, the two places I know you can see stars, three, actually. One is here in New Mexico. The other's in Ireland, on the west coast of Ireland, and in parts of the east coast, where I tend to hang out, some of the old family haunts. And at night, you can still see the Milky Way. You know, wow. It's really fantastic. The other place is Iraq. Uh-huh. I was quite amazed. I spent 3 tours in Iraq, you know, as a Dominican, checking on our people before and after the war. And I was astonished at night to go out and look up and see stars, just the sky full of stars. And you begin to understand something about the story of the Magi and how they followed a star, you know, coming to find Jesus. And I think probably a lot of people have found Jesus, you know, by looking at the stars.
That's incredible. Well, there's so much to talk about. I just want to acknowledge my Dominican roots. I was baptized by Dominicans in Vallejo, California at St. Vincent's Ferrer. And as you know, my cousin Patrick LaBelle is the chaplain at Stanford. And I made my return to the church when I came to revert back through the late Blaise Shower, who had the Liturgy of Santa Fe here, and just a delightful guy. Yeah. And so I want to remember him today. Anyhow, you've been talking at the Institute for Spirituality about globalization, the future of spirituality. Share with us a little bit about that and how you got to that area through all. I mean, you've been teaching. We'll give a little more background first. You've been teaching theology, and what have you been doing before this?
Well, for years and years, I've taught spiritual theology. For 30 years, I taught at Loyola University in the Institute of Pastoral Studies. And for 10 years during that time, I also had a position, half-time position at Oxford University, where I taught spiritual theology and did a lot of research. And I came back, I finished up both of those tours of duty. I'm not retired. after a brief stint at Emory University as a visiting professor, I was lassoed by my Dominican sisters, Dominican University in River Forest, which is right outside of Chicago. And so I'm a professor of theology there, and in a moment of weakness, I allowed them to bully me into being head of the department for my sins. And so I have a great interest in these areas, and since 2002, I've been teaching a special seminar on terrorism. It's called Humanism and Terrorism, and we examine all of the dimensions, really, of living in a world in which asymmetrical warfare has become the norm in many regards. Some very disturbing aspects of that. But I've had a great passion, oh gosh, since the late 60s, really, and the early 70s for environmental issues. And so I was involved in the first Earth Day in Chicago when George Wald and Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich and these people all came. And since then, I've been as much of an activist as I've been able to be in terms of environmental deterioration, ecological movement, and so forth. And I teach a course on ecology and theology. These things have a very uncanny way of coming together. It's almost like my trips to Iraq, which emerged really out of Dominican mission, the sisters going over to visit our hospitals and schools in Iraq, and invited me to go along with them, and I did. And I have developed a very great interest in the welfare of that country and the people of Iraq, and especially the Christian community in Iraq.
How significant is the Christian community in Iraq?
Well, it's small, but significant at the same time. The Christians have been present in Iraq from the beginning. The Christian community in northern Iraq is so old, the people still speak Aramaic. And the origins...
The language Jesus spoke.
The language that Jesus spoke. The origins are so old that you can't trace them as well as we would like. Many of them had become estranged from the church in the Great Nestorian heresy period. And yet they all, not all, there are still some Nestorian Christians, which is not technically a heresy but a schism. And I met a number of sisters in Basra, in the southern part of the country. The bishop, Gabriel Kassab, one of the greatest men I ever met, took us on a little walk through Basra, and we visited the sisters. And they were wearing white, like our Dominican sisters. They were young, they're wonderful women. And I asked him afterwards, I said, well, they're not members of our two congregations of Dominican sisters. What are they? He says, they're not Catholic. And I said, what? He said, no, they're Nestorian sisters. There's still a Nestorian church.
What is the Nestorian church?
Well, Nestorians split off from the Orthodox Church in the 5th century, basically. And it was a fight really between Nestorius and Cyril of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Alexandria, over the divine and human natures of Jesus, a very technical theological issue. And Nestorius, who was not an evil man at all, was concerned about the language and the implications of over-humanizing Jesus or under-humanizing Jesus. And basically, Nestorius believed that Jesus had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, which had been resolved earlier on, first at the Council of Nicaea and then later on, that Jesus has one nature, or two natures, one person. And he was having difficulty reconciling some of these issues, so that how could you have a single person with two natures, entirely different natures?
Unless he was a Gemini or something.
Yeah, and we went back and forth, exactly so, Libras. And there were a number of other issues involved, but the Nestorian church basically split off from the Orthodox church, and it moved gradually westward into the Persian Empire, and then eventually all the way to Western China. So when Marco Polo found himself in China, 700 years later, there he found Christians. They were Nestorian Christians. So they still exist. There are lots of Christian communities. The Chaldean Rite Christians and the Assyrian Rite Christians in the north are in communion with Rome. And we have a number of Dominicans there, all of whom are Iraqi. and they've been Christian forever. And so the communities there are not only ancient, but they're so solid. We had an ordination there in January of 2004. It was the last time I was able to get into Iraq. And I filmed the entire thing. I was able to make DVD prints of this ordination ritual, all of which was in Aramaic. It was done by the bishop, the local Bishop George, who later you might remember was kidnapped and released. They realized they had kidnapped the wrong man. The only parts that were not in Aramaic were really the homilies by the bishop and the French provincial who came over, and they spoke in Arabic and French as well. Most people speak both Arabic and Aramaic up in the north. But the Christian witness and the faith, the spirituality of the people is quite amazing.
Well, give us an update, because the impression here in this country is Westerners are only safe in the so-called green zone, but it sounds to me like you're out amongst them.
I was. And I would say today it is true that Westerners are basically safe because they are behind these walls, and they're not all that safe there. In 2004, I could still walk around in Baghdad and Mosul. In 2003, I went into Iraq 3 weeks after the cessation of hostilities. I happened to be in Lebanon. I was part of a conference on Christian mysticism, and I realized that I was only 500 miles away. And if I could get airfare to Amman, Jordan, I would be able to go into Iraq with friends of mine who work with the Quakers, who were going back in. And it worked just wonderfully. It was providential, really. And so I did, and I let the provincial know what I was up to. That was about all I had time to do. And slipped into Iraq. And it was an amazing adventure, going through the checkpoints, meeting the American soldiers, who were doing the very best they could to keep order. They wondered, what are you doing here? And I showed them my passport. And
were you wearing your clars?
No. I said, I'm here with my friends. We're going in to check on my people. And they said, are you a priest? And I said, yes. So they understood. And so we traveled 75 miles an hour across the desert for 8 hours and wound up in Baghdad. Went to a little hotel on the main street, since I didn't have any way to get in touch with the Dominicans in Iraq, or in Baghdad at that time, who later were quite irate with me for not immediately coming to the priory. And I said, I didn't even know if the priory was there. I didn't know how to get in touch with you. And they said, you still should have come. And I said, well, I would have. And they said, well, we didn't have any room, but you still should have come. Wonderful, wonderful people. But I was in this little hotel with my friends across the street from the Apostolic Nuncio's offices and house. And I went across to meet him. I wanted to know what had happened. He was one of the few diplomats who stayed in Baghdad through the entire war. And I was told later they always do. All of the others left, but the Apostolic Nuncio remains at his desk. And we thought he'd been killed at one time. Fernando Filone, who was an Italian, absolutely wonderful man. As soon as he knew I was there, he said, I will be right down. And he came down, spent 45 minutes with me telling me everything about, what had happened during the war, kind of amazed I was there at all. And later, just this last year, he was transferred to the Philippines, which is very interesting. He's a polished, wonderful diplomat, and the most humble and wonderful man you'd ever want to meet. So I was able to talk with him, and then I did make contact with the Dominicans, went up to Mosul, which is our strategic area, because in the 13th century, we had a house in Mosul. The Dominicans were in Iraq almost within the lifetime of St. Dominic. And we had an apostolate there. We were pretty much expelled from most of those areas by 1291, in the end of the Christian era, in the Crusades. But Dominicans stayed. We had people who were in Mosul, in Baghdad, and how they found out that the Dominicans had been slaughtered pretty much in Acre is that the habits had been taken to Baghdad, and they found them in the bazaar, bloody and ripped. The whole community had been put to the sword. But we kept going back. And in 1750, Italian Dominicans went back, reestablished the church in Mosul, and have been there ever since. The French took it over a few years later. And that church was remodeled extensively in 2000 to celebrate the 250th anniversary.
Well, how are their relationships with their Muslim predominant culture?
They were good. They were good. And even under Saddam Hussein, the Catholic Church and Christian churches experienced a good deal of protection. There was some harassment now and again. But Hussein depended upon support from the Christian community, small as it is. There were fewer than 1 million Christians in all of Iraq, and there are probably 750,000 now because so many have left. But Tariq Aziz was a Christian, and he was part of the cabinet. You know, he testified recently at the trial of Saddam Hussein. He always had a Christian around to make sure that he had support. You know, he was wily. He was a very clever, ruthless man. But there were occasions. The prior and the pastor up in Mosul told me that they had been harassed by one of the local warlords, you know, who was sort of troubling. And he got a phone call from the chairman, and he said, "I hear you have been receiving some problems from so-and-so." And he said, "Well, yes, it's been a little difficult with threats." He says, "Don't worry, it's taken care of." And that was the end. I mean, there was nothing more ever said. You know, he just sort of lay off these guys, and he laid off.
So it's who you know still.
It was then, yeah. Well, they were no great admirers of Saddam Hussein, believe me, but he did protect them. Now, after his fall, and they were really overjoyed to see the end of him, it became more and more difficult as time went on. They had first welcomed the American soldiers with pizza and pop and things like that. They came in, they were tired, and they were, you know, really bedraggled. And they were so grateful to have somebody who could speak English, among other things, and welcome them in. But as time went on, things got worse. And it really was, you know, from my viewpoint, and I was there at the time, when Paul Bremer dissolved the police, the judiciary, and the military all at one stroke, every semblance of law and order vanished from that country. It was, from my viewpoint, and he was acting under orders, the most ignorant, stupid thing that American foreign policy ever engineered. Because you just decapitated the country in terms of any semblance of authority. The only authority that was there at that time were the American soldiers on the street, and there were very few of them. And they had no real authority. And so when people started settling scores and old grudges and things like that, they would go to the Americans for help, and the Americans would just say, "There's nothing we can do." And so they had to defend themselves. And they could only do so by dint of shooting burglars and trying to hold the city together, a city of 6 million people, suddenly without police, without judges, without military help, really without even ordinary services. And they managed to pull that all together. And I walked through the city at that time. I mean, and no one was threatening me or doing anything. But they did it because of the mosques.
How so?
The mosques. Every neighborhood in Baghdad and in every large city has a mosque. And the imams are the spiritual leaders of the people. And so like the old Irish communities in Chicago and New York and Boston, the community is organized around the local religious center. And that was it. And so everything remained in place. It was an astonishing thing that the people remained as orderly as they could. Part of the problem that they faced was just at the end of Saddam Hussein's regime, he opened the prisons and let out all the political prisoners, which was a smart thing to do. But by opening the prisons, he also let out all the criminals. And there were real criminals. There were thugs and murderers and rapists and all sorts of people that were in jail. He let them all out. And so suddenly, the criminal element was at large, and there was nobody to restrain them. There were no police. There were no judges, no attorneys. They had all been removed. And so the people defended themselves the best way they could. But even during that period, I visited several homes of Christian Iraqis and Muslim Iraqis too, because they were very kind and most hospitable people I have ever met. And life went on as best they could make it go on.
Well, listen, we've only got a few minutes left, and we've had a great tour of Iraq. And so, as far as the globalization, the future of spirituality, what remarks would you might have just in the few minutes we have left?
Well, we're living in a different world, and with just one superpower, you know, it's amazing to watch how the United States has made itself the broker of world peace and war. But globalization is a multi-layered phenomenon. It has everything to do with trade barriers. It has everything to do with instantaneous electronic communication. We've seen both the upside and the downside of this. You know, we're instantly in touch with people now. In Iraq, the only way we could be in touch with people before was really by letters that were smuggled out. You know, people weren't allowed to have cell phones. They couldn't have television except the local TV and so on. So no satellite receivers or anything. Within weeks of the end of cessations, there were satellite dishes being sold on the street. People had Thuraya phones that they could use to call out using satellite communications. And so they were suddenly in touch with the world again. Now that's a global phenomenon. So we see the world drawing together with instantaneous communication. But because of the ubiquity of cell phones and the internet, the downside of that is a kind of fracturing of ordinary personal relationships. People absent themselves in the most amazing ways from live contact with other people, suddenly calling somebody 1,000 miles away to talk on the phone while you're trying to engage them in a conversation, or getting a phone call, you know, from somebody somewhere else. We've seen the downside of the internet, which is one of the most amazing developments, really, of all electronic communications. But now we're aware of the fact that child pornography, adult pornography, solicitation, criminal scams, all sorts of things are going on the internet, and we don't know how to regularize this. And so in this country and in Europe, law enforcement agencies from Homeland Security on down are trying to supervise and in a sense exercise some kind of surveillance over the traffic on the internet. Extremely difficult to do. So it's an immensely democratizing force, and at the same time it's wild. We're living in a global environment that is like the old frontier, in which almost anything goes. And so spirituality is faced with a number of challenges. How to face a very uncertain future, especially because of deteriorating global environmental systems and so forth on one hand, the breakdown of law and order in ways that we never even thought possible in the recent past.
Well, unfortunately, I've got to cut you off there. We've run out of time. Unfortunately, it went by too quickly. I was enjoying the conversation about Iraq. You gave me that bird's eye view, and I appreciate it. Father, please come back again. Next time you're in New Mexico, let me know. I'd love to have you back and carry this conversation. Sure. So we're indebted to Father Woods for coming out and being with us. Thank you for Brother Brian Dabowski for introducing me to you, and please come back again, local boy from Albuquerque here at Santa Fe Institute for Spirituality. So on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank you for viewing. I'm Bill O'Donnell for Spirituality TV. Stay tuned next week at this time for another program on spirituality.